So I want to thank everyone for coming. I'm Matthew Victor. I'm the founding president of the Good Governance Project, which is a newly formed initiative through a partnership with the BC Clouse Center for Constitutional Democracy. The Good Governance Project mission is to improve our systems of democracy, not any partisan end, but the means of self-governance, the decision-making processes. We ask, do the underlying values of our governing systems reflect our shared understanding of what a democracy should be? Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, there's a lot of work to do. We have structural problems, which our guest today will elaborate on. Without doubt, despite being a cornerstone of American progressive politics, and indeed the U.S. Constitution is derived in large part from the Massachusetts Constitution, we failed to live up to that in some respects. The state constitution explicitly states that the power resides in the people. It guarantees the exclusive right of governance of the people to the people. In my mind, this creates not just a right of self-governance, but a responsibility to govern, which means to participate actively. Whether or not you agree with that participation is a responsibility, currently in Massachusetts, for those who wish to participate, there are substantial and artificial barriers to meaningful participation in self-governance. While democracy reform is not the most glamorous issue, it is critical. We need to have meaningful participation in the governing process, not just because our state constitution confers this responsibility upon us, not just because it's critical to achieving the change that you may be seeking through government, but because participation, meaningful participation in itself is important. Knowing that your voice is heard is important. Knowing that the decisions that are made, even if you don't agree with that decision, that the decision makers hear you, truly hear you, allows us to live with the results, allows us to collaborate, allows us to see the big picture, that we are in this together, and we are in this democracy together. So with that, I will exit my soapbox and introduce our speakers. Oh, also, if you have any questions, feel free to use our chat box. So anything that comes to mind, feel free. Jay Kaufman served in our state legislature for 24 years and is the founding president of the Beacon Leadership Collaborative. Matt Miller is the co-founder of ActonMass, an organization that advocates for transparency, accountability, and progressive politics. Ryan Daulton is an organizer and campaign manager for ActonMass. Both are deeply involved in state and local politics and have worked on many campaigns. So with that, I will hand the virtual microphone over to Jay.
Thank you so much, Matt. And in particular, thank you to all of you for this Good Governance Project. It is incredibly heartening that you have this going on. It's also incredibly critical that you have this going on. So it is my hope and Matt's hope and Ryan's hope that we're going to be able to empower you, encourage you. Thank you for your engagement in this, because I think we're deeply committed to the public square, but also deeply aware of some work that needs to go on in the public square, and are honored to be in your company as we think about that. So a couple of introductory remarks. Matt and Ryan asked me to sort of set the table, so let me do that first with a couple of personal reflections. Serving in the legislature for 24 years was the privilege, the honor of a lifetime. It was just amazing to have 40,000 people put their faith in me to be, take my place in the line of succession of people who attempted to lead us here in the Commonwealth. So again, an honor, a privilege. In the next hour, you're going to hear less about that than about some of the frustrations and challenges that I faced. And I want us to be completely open and honest with you about those, but I don't want you to take those as discouragement from your interest in public life. On the contrary, I hope you take those, what we have to say, as inspiration and a specific targets and a specific callings to address the way we govern ourselves. That is the spirit in which we are engaging with you, and hopefully you will so engage with us. The work that I've done since leaving the legislature now almost 2 years ago has been to create and try to launch Beacon Leadership Collaborative, which is designed to encourage better public sector leadership. Because if nothing else, I take away from my 24 years in the legislature that there's lots of room for improvement. This holds true in the state, although we can't hold a candle to the need for improvement nationally. So I take some encouragement from the fact that the mountain that we have to climb isn't quite as formidable as the ones that our colleagues in Washington have to climb. So a couple of theses, if you will, that I start with. One is that the concentration of power that we see in Massachusetts, specifically in the Massachusetts House, like the concentration of power in Washington that we know more about, is completely alien to democracy. You cannot have that kind of concentration of power and have democracy. That's sort of the bottom line for me. Unless we're all in this together, engaged in the kind of intellectual combat that's enshrined in our founding documents, not only do we not have democracy, but the system we have is not sustainable. So I think we've got some fundamental threats, some fundamental challenges, and we will certainly touch on some of those. The second thesis is that it's very easy to blame, in the case of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the Speaker for being overly empowered for his concentration of power. And he is not blameless, but he is the fourth Speaker that I served under. And much of what we have to say tonight could be said for his predecessors. And unless we do something, it can be said for his successors as well. And on some level, it's too cheap to just sort of blame him. In fact, he's been overempowered. If he's been overempowered, and clearly it's a thesis of ours that he has been, it's because the members haven't done what they need to do. They haven't assumed their power and their responsibility. And in turn, if they haven't, it's because we, the public, we, the citizens, we, the people, haven't held their feet to the fire, haven't made them do what they needed to do in order to make the Speaker be in a very different position than he has right now. So the failures of democracy here are not because of Bob DeLeo per se, or specifically, or even primarily. They're because there are failures, and we need to own them as ours. And part of what's very exciting for me about the work that ActonMass is doing is they place the responsibility where it belongs, in the citizens, and are looking for the words, the encouragement to spur citizens to do what they need to do, and then create some of the infrastructure that allows them to do the work that the Constitution requires us to be doing. So we'll turn to that in a second. One last thing I want to do is sort of manage our expectations. First of all, I know that a lot of the work that you're doing is looking at our national system, and we are looking specifically in state, and even more specifically in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So I want to make sure you understand that, and anything that we say, you certainly can ask questions about a broader context in other institutions, but the framing for this is the Massachusetts House. Secondly, were we able to accomplish all the things that you're going to hear Matt and Ryan speak to, we will have met some very major challenges, and we will have accomplished some necessary but not sufficient conditions to restore democracy in this country. So nothing that we're going to say this evening specifically speaks to some of the underlying adaptive challenges that we've got. And you know the list of those as well as anybody does. So climate change, wealth and income inequality, or the disappearing middle class, depending on which language you want to use for the same problem. issues of race, issues of gender, gerrymandering, election reform, all those things that you're focused on happily. If we can accomplish some of what Matt and Ryan are going to speak to today, we will be better in a position to begin to address those underlying policy challenges that we face. But again, even if we're 100% successful tonight, we've still got those challenges to energize your work for a lifetime. Last thing I'll say is that, as I understand leadership, it is not about who's at the top of the heap, but it's a team sport. It entails all of us. And one way to manifest that this evening is to not assume that we are the sages on the stage, but we are trying to seed a conversation with you. We want and encourage you to interrupt, ask your questions in the chat line. When I'm speaking, Matt and Ryan are going to monitor the chat line. When they're speaking, I'm going to be one of the people monitoring the chat line. Matt Victor said he was going to be doing the same thing. So as your questions and comments come along, if they can help seed our conversation, we will want you to engage. With that, let me pass the virtual mic to Matt Miller, who's, as Matt Victor said, one of the founders of ActonMass. Again, with my thanks to Matt Miller and his partner in founding, Erica Eiterhoven, who has now won a seat in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, thankfully. Their work has really been very smart, very strategic, and I have a lot of hope for what they have set out to do. And hopefully you will learn, well, not hopefully, you will learn more about that in the next couple of minutes. So, Matt, with that.
Thank you so much, Jay. That's a really, really kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm going to screen share, and I want to make sure this works. I've got a few slides to share sort of our analysis of what's going on in the Massachusetts House. Can everyone see this okay? Awesome. And I'll just jump right into it. So leading with the conclusions is always a good idea when you've only got a little bit of time, and I want to make sure we have time for adequate discussion. But our analysis really points to three major problems that lead to a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, a lack of citizen input in the Massachusetts State House. And as a result, one of the least productive legislatures in the country in terms of bills getting passed and action taken. On the left, you'll see a sort of a very simplified version of the schoolhouse rock diagram of how a bill becomes a law. A state legislator has to write a bill, files it, it goes before a committee, whatever issue area that bill pertains to. There's a committee, just a collection of legislators that meet, discuss, take testimony, make changes, and then they will vote either to advance that bill or not. If they do advance it, and sometimes it has to go to multiple committees, but assuming it passes all those, it then has to go to the floor in both the House and the Senate, where, assuming it passes there as well, it gets sent to the governor's desk, and he can either sign it into law or veto it, just like the president with 2/3 supermajority. You can override that. But I really want to identify, and this whole process is governed by a rule book that the legislators write for themselves. That's one of the first things they take up at the beginning of each session. And there's really three areas that are problematic, that lead to a lack of transparency. The first is that committee vote is taken almost exclusively in secret. There's very few bills for which we have a recorded vote, a breakdown of how each individual legislator voted on that matter. And most of those bills, actually most of the bills before the legislature get sent to study. And that means actually that we'll talk about that more later, but it actually means that the bill just is killed. It's voted down. The second major problem is that when you get, assuming your bill or your matter gets before the floor, gets out of committee, it's actually very hard to get recorded votes in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. There's a significantly high threshold of the number of legislators who need to demand that a vote be recorded. Otherwise, it's not. And we're actually one of the we're one of the states with the highest barriers to a recorded vote on that matter. And then third, across this whole diagram, there really is a rush when bills come to the floor, and there's very often not even 24 full hours for the public and even legislators to take a look at what the committee's new version of a bill is that they're being asked to vote on. So I'll come back to each of these in turn, but we're going to talk first about these committee votes. On the right is a bill, is all the data we know about a bill called the Safe Communities Act when it was killed in 2018. This was a bill that a lot of progressive, democratic, centrist advocates in the state of Massachusetts put a lot of organizing into when Trump was elected. This would have limited local law enforcement's cooperation with ICE. The bill was voted down, it was sent to study, and what's worse, we don't have a record of how these legislators voted. Only 3 of them went on the record with the clerk. Those are the 3 in green, Senators Sonia Chang Diaz, Michael Rush, as well as Representative Juana Matias. Those 3 went on record saying they opposed that decision. But it actually, we don't know how the rest of these, I think it's 16 members voted. And we're in a minority of states that don't make these committee votes public. And that leads to a serious lack of accountability. On the right, here are 4 bills with broad public support. And actually not all of them progressive. There's bills from across the ideological spectrum. The Safe Communities Act has been killed 8 years in a row in committee. Any legislation to deal with the climate crisis, there hasn't been major legislation in 12 years, although they are currently working on something that may get over the finish line this session. Same-day voter registration has been 16 years, and progressive revenue, progressive taxation has been more than 20. So there's a real problem caused by this bottleneck. And to elaborate a little bit more, a study doesn't mean a study, what you think it would. On the right of this page is the study order that was issued for that Safe Communities Act back in 2018. It makes it sound as if the committee is going to continue to meet over the legislative recess, that they would issue a report by the end of the year. I did the naive thing and called the clerk and asked for a copy of this report, and the wonderful person sort of nervously laughed and said that they didn't file one. And that's actually true for almost all of these study orders. There may be an exception here or there, but pretty much a study order, there's no meeting, no study, no reports issued. There's really nothing that happens out of it. It's really a euphemism for killing a bill.
Matt, can I,
yeah, please.
Matt, let me jump in here. Kevin asked, what is the process for going on the record with the clerk? Can clerks release votes, or do they face a fine, punishment for doing so? Truth of the matter is that there are almost never any committee votes. The process is the chairman or chairwoman sends out a note saying, I encourage you to vote yes on this bill. Members do or do not respond to that email, and it makes almost no difference. The default is when daddy tells you to vote yes, you vote yes. So you don't even really need to engage. So it's, to say the votes are held in secret may be too generous. There may not even be any votes. And, you know, as Matt was just saying, sent to study really means no, but we don't have the courage to just say no to a bill. So we send it to study for the illusion of it being an ongoing opportunity to maybe pass it later. But it's not the clerk has no information because information is designed to not be available.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. This might actually, we've used this example for a while, and it's turning out to be quite the exception. There is a process, like a very archaic process, to go sign your name in dissent, which these 3 legislators chose to do. And that seems to have been pretty rare, and only because this was a really, really visible public issue. But you're right, in most cases it's an email. And the last point on study, I don't want to belabor this point, but every session they have a deadline for taking action on bills in their committee. And 52% of all bills were sent to study this session. That was on their deadline of February 5th. That's actually before any of the COVID-19 state of emergency or anything took place. You might want to give the legislators cut them a little slack this year with a global pandemic, but this 52% was the regular operation of the legislature before before a pandemic. There is some variance among committees. You'll see the Labor Committee and the Children and Families Committee have much lower study rates. Interestingly, the Children and Families Committee has written in their own rules that they will make votes available subject to request, and they do in most cases. That's up to the discretion of the chairs of those committees. So there might be a connection there between that rule and the less studies. So the second area I just want to highlight is the fact that when you get to the floor, there's a lot of off the record floor votes. Like I said earlier, you need 16 of the representatives to stand to get a recorded vote. Otherwise, it's not recorded. And I do hope you'll indulge me for a second. Can everyone see this video? This is our co-founder, Erica Eiterhoven. I just want to share 30-second clip of what happens if you don't get the recorded vote.
Why are we in the dark on all these votes? The House usually doesn't record how state reps vote. The exception is if there's a roll call vote. To request a roll call, 16 reps have to demand it, and it's extremely rushed. They have 5 seconds to jump to their feet before the chair declares if enough of them demanded it. Without roll call, there's just a voice vote. The chair simply declares the outcome of the vote by how many ayes and nays they hear. There is no record on how wide the margin was or who voted which way. And in most cases, nobody says a word. The chair just decides what the outcome would have been based on what he or she is told by leadership.
Amendment number 18, Representative Jones of North Reading and other members of the House move to amend the order by inserting after proposed Rule 33F the following. 33J.
Chair hears no objection. The clerk will dispense with the further reading of the amendment. Chair hears none. Question comes on the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed no. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
Yeah.
So I hope the sound came through, or at least the captions got you a bit of the feel of that. That all about took all of 30 seconds. So for mundane details or process questions, sure, that seems like a fine process. But if you're talking about real policy making, you would expect a debate that was a little more formalized or longer or involved any speeches whatsoever by representatives. When you look at comparable states like Florida, Texas, and Colorado, we're kind of in a league of our own. Most other comparable states have much lower roll call thresholds. You only need 2 people in Pennsylvania to stand for roll call. You need just 5 in Florida. And so there's a real organizing challenge for our state representatives in Massachusetts, which really does lead to less requests for votes. I don't want to belabor this point too much. We can come back to it in the Q&As, but we analyzed all the votes that happened in 2019, and there were 140 of them total in the House, and only about 15 of them, to my mind, are meaningful, show any breakdown that wasn't simply a straight party line vote or procedural votes. There's a lot of procedural votes that are just required to be recorded under the Constitution. And the Republicans, interestingly enough, do tend to get enough recorded votes when they want to make a point. So that's why you see those 93. But in terms of the spectrum of ideology among the Democratic Party, the members who make up 80% of the body, there's very little recorded difference. So I will just briefly overview the final problem, which is, a bill can sit in committee for 18 months, up to 2 years in some cases without any action, but then there is no requirement to give representatives enough time to read the bill when it has a new version and it's being voted on. And I'm going to give you an example from last year. These are all the timestamps of a major supplemental budget that was taken up by the House in October of 2019. The bill text was released at on a Tuesday at noon, and the reps had a deadline of 5 hours later to read that 50-page bill, which references the IRS tax code, other portions of Massachusetts law, and even they have 5 hours to read it, let alone try to identify anything they might want to change. In this case, we were working with some reps on the inside, and we noticed that there was a $37 million tax break for the largest corporations that was just added in the new version. So in this case, we were able to get some reps to file an amendment to remove that provision. But in terms of the timeline for the rest of the session, they actually voted on this the very next day. There was really, if you're honest, there was really only 4 hours in the morning where you could try to get constituents to do outreach to their reps, because by 1 p.m., they were sitting in the chamber. By 4 p.m., they took a vote on this bill. So that is, and the news isn't able to cover that honestly in real time. Most people learn about these votes after they happen. So, you know, we can come back to this in the Q&A if folks are interested. One of our earlier campaigns was to ask reps to sign a pledge that would commit them to taking actions on their own, to make their own votes public, to stand for roll calls, take actions individually to try and fight back against some of these problems. But I'm going to turn it over, and actually we've gotten a large amount of success on that pledge. We have 11 incumbent pledge signers and another 7 coming in. So we actually have now a sort of a sizable body of 16 to 18 reps who we can count on to stand for roll call. So that will improve things, but that's still a very individual action on the part of reps. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to really talk about the campaign we're doing now about rules reform.
Thanks, Matt. So I think as Jay was saying, as we think about ActonMass and our theory of change, in our minds, a democracy has an active public participation. And like 1/10 of a democracy happens at the ballot box, and the balance happens after we go and vote. And to make legislation, to get legislation, particularly in our state house, which as Matt just documented, is inert and intransigent and lacks transparency, you need constituents to continue to pressure legislators to get key bills across the line. So let me quickly go through that as a problem and what we think the solution is. So you can see here, as we've discussed, there's this sort of gap, this is well documented in research, between the demands and public support and then the actions of legislators, which results in weak representation. The data show that this results in an over-conservatism estimate. There are some really interesting studies where you ask congressional aides to predict the public support for various issues amongst the constituents of their representative, and they're wildly off, and oftentimes in an overly conservative estimate. So as we or over conservative ideology, so as we step back and think about solving this problem, particularly at the state level where we have more control and it's easy to participate in politics and affect the outcome, our theory changes sort of 3 things that we do at ActonMass. So 1, we identify campaigns that are short-term in nature and give activists, advocates control over the outcome. We build constituent power so that way our democracy is more vibrant over time. We're trying to build a more participatory democracy, and that begins with making the State House more transparent and empowering constituents with information. And then lastly, ActonMass, we have an organizing arm. We organize alongside our constituents because that muscle to pressure your legislators is not well worn. College educated in this country spend, Etan Hirsch, who's a professor at Tufts, has some really interesting information on this. College educated in this country spend about 2 hours a day consuming political information. Only 2% of that, only 2% of those 2 hours is spent doing any sort of political work. Most of it is contemplation, reading, and discussion. That's not a healthy democracy. You can go to the next slide, Matt. So yeah, so what do we do at ActonMass to try and solve this problem? We identify campaigns, like I said, that have 2 attributes. So there's broad public support. So we know that it's in play amongst the constituents. And then there's it's actionable. There's room for advocacy and organizing to pressure representatives. And we think that building campaigns around that types of legislation, like same-day voter registration, which exists in 21 states, doesn't exist in Massachusetts, is a great example. Or the rules fight, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can go to the next one, Matt. So this is sort of a power map of politics in general in the country, but then also Massachusetts. So you have this voter, constituent on the left, this woman. She just voted at the ballot box but as a result of the lack of transparency, shortage of committee votes, floor votes, no time to review a bill. There's this smoke screen that really takes away her voice and makes it impossible to participate in the political process and lawmaking. This gap, as we know, is filled by corporations in a very pernicious way. We live in a $1, one vote country. And it's also filled by advocates, which do really wonderful work, but sometimes develop close relationships with representatives, and therefore are hesitant to kind of like really push to try to accelerate the rate of change. This results in years of delay and weak representation between the constituent and the legislator. So this is like kind of like the crux of our theory of change, is we believe in building the muscle, constituent muscle and power. So that way it's more intuitive, it's more active to go straight to your legislator to pressure for bills. And as you can see in this little thing on the right, we really don't think it's sufficient to elect good candidates. A functioning, healthy democracy has a populace that's continuing to pressure legislators. You can go to the next slide, Matt. And then what we do is once we build these district teams, a good first step is organizing a meeting where you have anywhere from 10 to 50 people, constituents. You organize your neighbors, you have a meeting with your legislator and tell them that these demands are really important to our community. And we need to try and, for instance, like accelerate the rate of this bill and take it out of committee. And if that doesn't work, we have an arsenal of tactics that we can use to build pressure, whether that's public forums, phone banking the districts. These are well-worn forms of activism. I think what's really unique for us is trying to build these constituent meetings where we have large groups of people meeting with reps on a consistent basis. So Matt, you can go to the next one. And that brings us to what we're doing right now. So our current campaign is called the Transparency is Power campaign. And I think this fits very snugly into the attributes that I was describing earlier of campaigns that we organize. So you can go to the next one, Matt. So their legislators at the start of every session write their own rule book, as Matt described. So there will be a vote. We know it's in 4 months, it's time bound, and the demands are very clear. Our demands are to make committee votes public, to allow the public to have 72 hours to review bills prior to a final vote, and then to reduce that threshold from 16 to 8, which would be reducing it from 10% of the 160 in the House to 5%. And then our strategy is, like I said, organizing district teams, building pressure, and then escalating. A little bit of history. So amendments, last time the rules were written at the start of the session in 2019. These similar amendments were introduced. These are amendments to the order that dictates the rules for the legislative session. Both time to review bills, 72 hours, and public committee votes were voted down. You can see there about 50 to 110, depending on the vote. And Matt already talked about our pledge that we initiated. And we also had a ballot question this year that asked in 16 districts voters if they supported public committee votes. And that was an overwhelming support, 90%. But again, that's all just a tool to kind of like build momentum behind the campaign. And I would be negligent if we didn't ask you to organize with us. In addition to all the wonderful work that you're doing, if you would like to join a district team, or if you know people who believe in a functioning, healthy democracy in districts across the state, you can go to actonmass.org/the-campaign. And right at the top, there's a sign-in form or a form to sign up. If you sign up, we'll be in touch with you within 24 hours to talk about building a strategy in your district. So that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was super informative. I will open the floor to anyone who might have questions. I've got plenty myself, but if anyone wants to chime in, feel free.
I have a question about, you had questions on the ballot in 16 districts. Could you say a little bit about how you chose those districts and what your expectations are of the people serving in them when it comes to taking this vote in January?
I can take that. So we started planning for this before the global pandemic hit. And so we thought, let's try to get half of the districts, or maybe we'll get 120. To get these questions on the ballot only takes 200 valid signatures in a state rep district. And so we thought that'll be easy. Well, it turns out it's significantly harder when there's a pandemic, but we specifically targeted a number of districts through electronic signatures, the chair of a committee that we had a coalition partner 350 that really cared about a climate bill. We targeted the chair of that committee in Lowell. There were a number of representatives who are Democrats, did not vote in favor of transparency in the last session when it was given a chance during the rules debate, but who we thought their voters would weigh in very strongly in support. We also did key members of leadership. You know, Bob DeLeo's, the Speaker's district himself, sent a very positive message that they wanted committee votes to be public. So it's a combination of pressuring leadership as well as people we thought would be swing votes. And then, yeah, that was it.
Thanks, man.
So you mentioned that that many Democrats, which is the overwhelming majority of our state representatives, many Democrats voted against transparency, and I guess that's you know, leadership has some resistance to increase transparency. What, and I guess I would address this to Jay, from your experience, what, you know, what is the mechanism for keeping Democratic House members in line, in lockstep with what leadership wants? What happens if they stray?
So first of all, I have a pet peeve about using the term leadership when it comes to referring to Bob DeLeo and his team. They are the authority figures. I think they're pretty wanting in the leadership department. So again, I'll call them the authority structure. And the authority structure has enormous ability to encourage you to behave. The speaker and the speaker alone determines where your office is going to be, what staff you have or don't have. So far there hasn't been a she, he determines the fate of your legislation. If you have a top priority bill and he doesn't like you, that top priority bill goes nowhere. So a lot about how you operate and your ability to get the job done for your own values and for your district depend on being a good follower of the guidance, if I can call it that you get from the speaker. So there's an enormous, the committee assignments are all in the speaker's hands. The committee, everything about your life as a legislator is in the hands of the speaker. And again, I think Matt made mention of some comparisons across state lines. There are very few speakers as super empowered as ours is here in Massachusetts. Some of it is in the rules, some of it is just tradition, but it's going to take a lot to shake that power loose. I think it was Frederick Douglass that said, "Power yields nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will." We're going to need to make some demands to change that.
So Will asks, for bills in committee being sent to study, how do Massachusetts numbers compare to other states? In other words, what portion of the bills being sent to study are different versions of bills that pass through committee versus what bills are killed outright?
I can take an initial stab at this, but then I'd be curious Dave's thoughts. I'm not aware, so it's actually a little bit difficult to compare the process of different legislatures because they run on different yearly cycles and whatnot. But I'm pretty sure, Jay can back me up if I'm wrong, or come back to me if I'm wrong. We tend to have more bills filed than other legislatures, and there's a typically when a bill is advanced, all the other companion bills that deal with that same issue are sort of all lumped together into a new version. And that can include even bills that are contradictory. So if there's a bill about cutting the income tax rate and raising it, if the committee were to take up a new version of that, typically they will consolidate that all into one bill and advance it along. So there are almost no bills that are voted down in our legislature. I believe that's different in other legislatures. I don't know if Jay, you have more comparable insight on that.
Yeah, Will, I don't have a direct answer to your question. How our quote unquote study orders, which again that's to abuse the term study. I don't know how they compare to other states. I do know that some states at least require a roll call vote on every bill that's filed. And again, to Matt's point, that would be impossible here because there's 6,000 plus bills filed every session, which is in and of itself ridiculous. There really need to be some limits on how many bills an individual legislator can file. That's one of the sort of structural reforms that I think we can make. Just one little anecdote. At one point, the first time I got to chair a committee, my Senate co-chair, most of the committees are joint committees, House and Senate. So my Senate co-chair and I decided that we were going to break with tradition, and actually take votes and record no votes. Because that seemed to be the only honest thing to do. You don't call something a study if you really are trying to kill it, at least by my standards. So we did that. We issued a couple of no votes. The pushback that we got from our colleagues was overwhelming and, quite frankly, pretty disgusting. How can you do this to me? Can't you allow me to save face with my constituents so that they can at least think that I'm doing a job, and that what they're interested in still has some life to it? It's just you're killing me. You can't do this. So the pushback was just overwhelming. We were the first committee to have done that in probably decades, and we stopped doing it. I'm embarrassed to admit. I think we should have continued, but I didn't push that hard. For many of the same reasons that that I referred to earlier about the power of the speaker and my ability. It would have seriously compromised, if not completely eliminated, my ability to get anything done. So in many ways, and I will readily acknowledge this, I was complicit in the system in the House because there was a trade-off. Be very specific about this. I think some people on this phone and this Zoom call will know this, but the sort of signature piece that I've been working on for the last 10 years I was in the legislature was the Fair Share Amendment to the Constitution, so we could have something approaching a graduated income tax rather than the flat income tax that we have here. And I felt very strongly about that as absolutely essential if we were going to have fair taxation, not to mention sustainable revenue. So I was absolutely committed to that. And the amount of crap that I put up with to be in a position to advance that was almost limitless. And I made conscious decisions to go along to get along in order to stay in the position of chair of the Revenue Committee so that I could advance that bill. I would probably do the same thing again. I thought it was important enough and the value was there for me and for a lot of the advocates who were encouraging me to do whatever I needed to do to be able to advance the cause. But it was a lot of tongue biting, and it took months and months and months of healing after I left the legislature to begin to sort of come back to an even keel, not feeling that I had so compromised my own values. And every one of my colleagues is under the same kind of pressure. The good ones are conscious of it and make their decisions consciously and conscientiously. Sadly, over time, it gets to be automatic and you don't even think about it anymore.
So Kevin asks, is there an opportunity to form a sort of pact with more than 18 reps so that every vote gets a roll call vote? And I would add to that question, do you find that in the state legislature, there's a growing concern among representatives, such as newly elected Representative Erica Oderhoven, So I guess, any thoughts on this pact, and do you think that there's maybe more movement towards something like this pact?
It's kind of what we tried to do with the pledge. It's not a roll call on every single vote, but it is on anything that a representative is co-sponsored. So that could be the bill, the underlying bill that an amendment is based on, or a bill being brought to the floor. There have been some efforts in the previous election cycle, in the 2018 election cycle, there were a number of candidates who signed a pledge that said they would stand for roll call if anyone asked for it ever. And that was the representatives themselves, and Senator Becca Rausch actually wrote it, and to her credit has stood by it. But pretty much all the other representatives have stopped complying with that because they get a lot of pressure from their colleagues when, say, a Republican or a conservative Democrat asks for something, or maybe something they don't think is strategic, and they want to have all these exceptions. So we think the pledge is really the pledge we've designed that now we'll be able to test in January how good that 18 holds up. But that still is relying on 18 people to still to be organized. And so it's that longer term rule change that Ryan outlined to lower it to 8 to get us closer to some of these other states that we think will be the systemic shift we need. But that's a great question. That's the first place we went to, was trying to form that pact.
If I may, I want to add to that, Kevin. I think it is a very good question. On some level, it is remarkable how little it would take to shake up that place and start to effect a change. One member standing up and demanding an explanation from a chairman about a bill before it gets voted on would send shockwaves through the building. It just takes one person to say, this is not the way we ought to operate. Here's how we ought to operate, and start behaving that way. An alliance between good government types across party lines would be remarkable. I mean, the Republican Party members typically stand up for roll calls in part so that they can use that roll call to embarrass their Democratic opponents in an upcoming election. What would it be like if a comparable number of Democrats started standing up every time the Republicans stood up, in exchange for the Republicans standing up for the Democrats? When the Democrats call for a roll call, you could get to 30 people standing up for roll calls overnight, absolutely overnight, if there were a will to do that. So I'm hoping that even if the drive for this pledge isn't as successful as we all hope it will be, if we can get a couple of people who are willing to start behaving as if the world had already changed, and start behaving as if the world as the world ought to be, it's guaranteed to produce some results.
The lowering of the needed number of representatives, the policy change that Ryan discussed, bringing that down to 8, is that something that takes place in the January rules discussions, or could that be something that's introduced as a bill later on, or is it that all rule changes take place during that January session?
I can take that. Yeah, at the start of each session, there's an order that's introduced. It's usually in the House H. This year it'll be H. 2021. That will be needs to pass before committee positions are allocated, and the rules change would be a representative filing an amendment to that order, H. 2019. Now, in the middle of the year or to another bill, could you file a rules amendment? I think, Matt, that's feasible, right? Like, they tried to do that at one point this summer to increase the roll call threshold, I thought.
You can, the authority structure pushed another order when COVID hit in order to change the rules to allow for remote sessions, and they did include some changes. So I'm not sure if there's an easy way for a rank and file member, a regular representative, to file something, but I'm sure there are other parts of law that could be changed. This is a little bit off topic, but for example, open meeting law only applies to municipalities in this state, doesn't apply to our state legislature. So there are legal changes you could make, but in terms of the rules that govern the House, it's in our Constitution that says the House shall set their own rules, the Senate shall set their own rules. So you'd either need a constitutional amendment or to change the rules, I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Jeremy asks, is it possible through legislation or a constitutional amendment to bring more transparency to the votes? Is it feasible? It seems like that is what the various ballot questions are attempting to achieve.
I'll take that real quick because it kind of fits into what I was just saying. I didn't see that. For a so the Constitution would require us to do a constitutional amendment, and the trick with that is you need, for a constitutional amendment to go to the ballot, you need it to pass 2 legislative sessions in a row with 50 legislators supporting it, and that would probably be an internal organizing challenge just to get it on the ballot. I would love to, especially if folks have the legal expertise or can help connect us with the legal expertise to see if, if there's a hole in this argument, we don't need a constitutional amendment, then yeah, let's get a ballot question out to just pass a regular statute. But my belief is that we have to do a constitutional amendment route, which requires this 50 votes in 2 successive sessions.
Let me just add that the process of amending the Constitution is, as it ought to be, complex. One of the elements of complexity is it's expensive. It is also very slow. I think I would, if I were involved in a conversation about strategy, I'd say let's find 2 or 3 people who are willing to be, if you will, at worst, sacrificial lambs. They're willing to stake their careers on just standing up for process and for democracy as we understand it. I guess I put my faith in that process before a constitutional amendment. If we can find somebody willing to do it, several somebodies, or at least one somebody willing to do it. Basically have them embarrass their colleagues into doing what they ought to do.
Well, we are closing in on our time. So I encourage anyone who's got something in there. Oh, there's another question. Has anyone attempted to deal directly with the speaker through negotiation or otherwise? Is he 100% against any reform? Should I have invited Bob DeLeo to this conversation? Maybe.
Boy, that would be a fun conversation. I think certainly, as I understand it, Matt, you can speak to this better than I can. At the beginning of the now almost completed session, there were some negotiations with him about some desired rules reform. So yes, it is possible. I don't know how successful that was or how successful it might be. But Matt, do you want to say something about what happened 2 years ago? Or at the beginning of this session?
So at the beginning of this session, I understand that there were a number of freshman reps, newly elected reps like Maria Robinson, Lindsay Savadosa, Tammy Gouveia, and others who went in there and said, I'm going to fight for transparency. There's a custom where you have to let the speaker know when you're going to give your first speech, because it's called an inaugural speech, and the speaker often isn't the person with the gavel, but for someone's inaugural speech, he will be. So they went to him and said, we really want to make this place more transparent, so here's what we're pushing for. And we weren't, ActonMass was like a month old at that point. I didn't get any clear sense that the speaker was really willing to make changes there, but there are conversations happening now, and I think hopefully folks will see this presentation and realize, oh my gosh, they're going to probably win this committee votes amendment. We ought to just give it to them. But that's sort of my answer. The speaker hasn't given us a meeting. We asked him to sign our pledge. His office did not return our request. But I don't know if there's been any other discussions that maybe you had, Jay, or.
No.
Anything for, okay, I didn't think so. Okay. Danielle asks other allies in the House and Senate. Definitely those three women reps I just mentioned, as well as pretty much all the people who signed our pledge, who signed it early. All the incumbents are really allies. There are some folks in the Senate, like Senator Becca Rausch, who really made it a key issue. Senator Jamie Eldridge has been really good on this issue.
Mike
whenever these come
Connolly.
up, yes, Mike Connolly.
I have to give the BC Law shout outs.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. As well as on these transparency issues, the Republicans unanimously voted for the transparency change. So on this issue, they're an ally, even if they're not an ally from my political perspective on other issues.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. I encourage you to subscribe to the ActonMass email newsletter. Jay, I don't know if you've got something from the Leadership Collaborative.
Certainly encourage folks to go to the website, which is beaconleadershipcollaborative.org. There's a lot there about what we would like to do. And I know that, Matt, you and I have talked about the possibility of some kind of event for law school students. And I think something will happen through the Rappaport Institute in January, probably, to sort of bring you some of the concepts that we work with and opportunity to get a sense of what leadership looks like or might look like. And then if that appeals to you, I'd love to have you enroll in one of our programs or even shape one specifically for future lawyers.
That is exciting. Thank you everyone for joining.
In the chat there. Thank you so much.
Yep, URL's in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed and we're not too frustrated by this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions and want to get involved in the Good Governance Project or otherwise. And enjoy your evenings, everyone.
Thanks again for this opportunity, and glad to have your company in this journey.
You as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.